Good morning, everyone. How are you? Everybody doing well? So you think we'll be skiing by tomorrow? A little snow in the air, maybe? Well, good morning and welcome as we celebrate the creation of a special archive. I'm Alberta Comer. I'm the Dean of the Marriott Library and the University Librarian, and we're so proud to be part of bold initiatives such as the Downwinders of Utah Archive. The Downwinders Archive not only contains numerous materials such as letters, documents, videos, and the like, but it is an interactive archive that allows us to see this important information in a way that truly enhances our understanding of a subject that has impacted many, many individuals and families over the past 6 decades. It's our hope that this archive will positively impact the Downwinders and their families, and will help educate the community at large. I would like to now introduce Mary Dickson, an award-winning writer living in Salt Lake City. For 30 years, Ms. Dickson has written about the health consequences of nuclear testing in the United States. Her 2007 play, Exposed, which opened to sold-out houses and critical acclaim, was a landmark work that put a human face on a chapter of American history that is seldom explored in drama or literature. It combines the very personal story of the playwright and her sister who were victims of U.S. nuclear weapons testing, with powerful documentation, including declassified portions of the Atomic Energy Commission minutes, public testimony, interviews, and personal accounts. It reveals the human toll of 40 years of nuclear testing in the United States. She has spoken at symposia, conferences, and classrooms about the human consequences of nuclear testing. In 2013, she was recognized by the Alliance for Nuclear Responsibility in Washington, D.C. for her lifetime of work on behalf of Downwinders. She also recently presented at the World Nuclear Victims Forum in Hiroshima, Japan. Ms. Dickson, a tireless advocate for the Downwinder population, has been instrumental in today's events, and we're so pleased to have her here with us. Please join me in welcoming Mary Dickson.
Thank you, Alberta, and mostly thanks to the Marriott Library for putting together this incredibly significant and important collection. This is, as you probably heard, an issue that is very near and dear to my heart, and one that I have pursued passionately. As she said, I first went to Hiroshima in 2008 with the Nuclear Studies Institute from American University. That was an amazing journey where I got to meet with a lot of hibakusha. That's the Japanese word used to describe survivors of the bomb, and their stories were incredibly haunting. It was interesting because when I spoke at a university in Kyoto, they introduced me as an American hibakusha, and I realized that, like the people in Japan and Nagasaki, I also was a survivor of the bombs, but the bombs that were exploded on our own soil by our own government. Last November, as she said, I was in Hiroshima again to speak at a conference on, it was an international conference on victims of nuclear weapons, and I was there to represent American Downwinders, and I heard more stories. Very troubling. It was a very difficult experience. I spent the last day in the Hiroshima Peace Park with a gentleman from India, and the two of us couldn't even speak. We just sat there and wept for 20 minutes. I am a Downwinder. Between 1951 and 1958, our government exploded 100 nuclear bombs above ground at the Nevada test site, not far from Las Vegas, putting unsuspecting American citizens at risk and in harm's way. Atmospheric testing was banned in '92, but it went underground. In total, and this number is so big, it's hard for people to comprehend. In total, our government exploded 935 nuclear weapons on our own soil, all of them far more powerful than the bombs that leveled Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The mushroom clouds from some of those underground tests, the leaks, they were as big as some of the clouds from above ground testing. Radioactive fallout from those 4 decades of nuclear testing has left a devastating legacy, not only in Utah, which was directly downwind of the test site, but across our entire country. We were victims of the deadly winds of the Cold War. Like tens of thousands of other Americans, I grew up under the clouds of nuclear testing, and my life and work have been shaped by what happened to me and so many of the people I know and love at the hands of our own government. And it was all in the name of protecting us from communism during the Cold War. There is a credit card-sized map of the U.S. I carry in my wallet. I left some of them out here. You probably can't see this. But it shows where the winds carried fallout from testing in Nevada, which was only conducted when it blew eastward. It goes, Utah and Nevada, if you look at it, are almost, well, you can see that Utah's almost completely blacked out. And that ink spreads all the way to New York and into Canada. And there are regions in the middle of this map where most of our nation's food was grown that are also in black ink. Radiation didn't respect arbitrary lines on a map. It was picked up by the jet stream and carried across the country, where it fell out in rain and in snow and worked its way into the food chain and into our bodies. I've shown this map. Richard Miller is the man who put this together, to people in Utah and across the country, and they're always shocked because most people had no idea that fallout spread so far, crossing over their cities and towns. I carry it as a way of bearing witness, but there's another map I carry of the scars on my body. The earth shifted for me in the spring before my 30th birthday, when I was diagnosed with thyroid cancer. That's a cancer that's common in people who were exposed to fallout as children. They cut out my thyroid and the lymph nodes around it. A few days later, they gave me radioactive iodine to drink to destroy any remaining tissue. The nurse wheeled me back to my room in this high-backed wheelchair made of lead so that I could not radiate her or other people I was around. There was a sign on my door that said, "Caution, radioactive material." My hospital bracelet had the same sign on it because I was the radioactive material. Every day a radiologist would open my door and point his Geiger counter at me to see how hot I was, and I was isolated in that small hospital room until the reading on the Geiger counter was low enough that I could be around people again. And before I went home, the doctor cautioned me not to be around babies or pregnant women for a few more days and told me not to get pregnant for a year, and I never did get pregnant. I grew up on the rim of Parley's Canyon here in Salt Lake City, drinking fresh milk from a nearby dairy, eating fresh vegetables from the garden, mixing sugar with snow and pretending it was ice cream, and playing in puddles of rainwater, assuming that, as the Mormon hymn told us, all was well. How were any of us to know that a silent poison was threading its way through our bodies, that many of us would get sick and some of us would die, when our government repeatedly assured us there was no danger? They gave us booklets, Preston Truman brought one, that said, "Some of you," this is a quote, "may have been inconvenienced by our test operations," and telling us not to let reports of Geiger counters, quote, "going crazy bother us." They encouraged people living near the test site to watch the blast as part of a family activity, and none of us knew that the radioactive debris in those awe-inspiring clouds would devastate families and communities across America. We blithely went about our lives assuming we were safe. We trusted the government when it told us we had nothing to fear and repeatedly said there is no danger. After I got sick, my sister and I began keeping a list of friends and neighbors who had cancer and autoimmune diseases. It didn't take long for our list to reach 54 people who grew up in a 5-block area around us. My childhood friend Tammy was first on the list. She died of a brain tumor when we were 10. Her little brother died 3 weeks later of testicular cancer. He was 4 years old. Their devastated mother asked her pediatrician if it was a coincidence that there were 10 other people at the time on the block who had cancer. Over the years, other people from my childhood neighborhood, including my best friend, her sister, her father, have died of cancer, leukemia, lymphoma, and other fallout-related illnesses. So many have died that one of my schoolmates years later said he felt lucky to have made it to age 40. In Utah, these are not unusual stories. I've listened to countless other stories of those made sick from radiation exposure. A soldier who marched with troops into Ground Zero after a blast at the test site so the military could see what effect it would have on them in the event of an actual nuclear attack. He now has multiple myeloma. The mother who called me one morning to tell me she had lost 3 babies to leukemia and now her 2 surviving adult children had cancer. The woman whose husband died of cancer and then watched helplessly as her 5-year-old son developed bone cancer. After waking up from surgery, he looked up at her and asked, "Where's my leg, Mama?" She didn't know she was a downwinder, and she was from St. George. The more I wrote and spoke, the more I testified at public hearings, the more people came to me with their stories. There is great power in these stories. The people who share them are not numbers. They're not a statistic. They're human beings who have suffered, who have watched their loved ones die, who were innocent victims of Cold War policies. Stories are my most powerful tool. They're discounted by a lot of those in the military and at the test site, saying they're just anecdotal, but they, for us, are very real. They are evidence. That's why I wrote my play, Exposed, that was produced in 2007, and it ended with the somber listing of the names of the dead. My sister's name was the last name read on that list. She didn't make it. And after each performance, we had a big sheet of butcher paper outside the theater, and we asked people to put the names of those they had lost. That became so full that we couldn't fit any other names just in a few nights. There was no room left on that paper. What's very hard for me and others to reconcile is that our government knew the facts about fallout, about contaminated milk, about the susceptibility of children, and they lied to the people. People like me, my sister, my friends, and all of us across this state. There are declassified minutes from the Atomic Energy Commission that Preston has shared with me that the government misled us, covered up the facts, and endangered us. In the early years of testing, when one Atomic Energy Commission commissioner expressed concern about reports of livestock and people dying, another commissioner responded, "Nothing is going to get in the way of testing, nothing." He said, "Fallout is a fact of life, and people need to learn how to live with it." Then he suggested that what was needed was, quote, "a judicious handling of public information." There was also, not many people know about this, a 1954 Atomic Energy Commission agreement that barred the U.S. Health Service from releasing any information to the public about radiation released from tests and made the Health Service criminally liable if it disclosed such information. And that agreement was in effect until 1970. The Cold War had casualties in America and in every country where nuclear weapons were tested. Barbara Rose Johnston wrote a book called Half-Lives and Half-Truths and says, quote, "Contrary to claims of American and Soviet officials, the arms race did not prevent nuclear war. Rather, it was a nuclear war." Those of us who have suffered in that undeclared war are witnesses that radiation works in strange ways. It doesn't kill you outright. It attacks cells that mutate and can take years, even decades, to manifest as cancer, leukemia, immune system disorders, and other disorders. And this is also very troubling. The genetic damage radiation causes can be passed on to future generations, which means that many fallout-related cancers have yet to surface. And to me, one of the saddest things is that most people who are downwinders will never know they are, and will never know they were casualties of testing. It's impossible to know how many cancers and other illnesses may be linked to fallout, how many communities, neighborhoods, and families have suffered. We'll never know. Some estimates put the number of American fallout victims as high as 800,000. So many of the downwinders that I've worked with who have dedicated their lives to keeping the story alive are literally dying off. And that is why I am so passionate about ensuring that all of our stories are not forgotten. We must share our stories. We must tell them, as painful as it might be to do so. And that is why, to me, this Marriott Library Archive is so important. It will keep those stories alive, and not only for researchers, but for future generations. Ultimately, it will serve not only as a record of that shameful past that we share, but as a warning. It's been my hope that those who know firsthand the tragedies of nuclear testing will share their stories so that the mistakes of the past will never, ever be repeated. Because if we learned anything at all from nuclear testing, it's that we all live downwind and we are all Habakasha. It is my great pleasure now to introduce Jim Matheson. Jim is the Chief Executive Officer of the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association, the national service organization that represents the nation's more than 900 private, not-for-profit, consumer-owned electric cooperatives that provide service to 42 million people in 47 states. He joined that association in July 2012 following distinguished careers in public service and in the private sector. Before joining, it's called Enrica, Jim served as principal public policy practice for the international law firm of Squire Patton Boggs based in Washington. From 2001 to 2015, he was elected to serve in the U.S. Congress. That's 7 terms. During his tenure on Capitol Hill, he was known as a legislator who worked with colleagues on both sides of the aisle. And to me, very importantly, during his time in Congress and continuing, he has been a great friend of and advocate for downwinders. His connection is personal, as he will tell you. He was among, I have to give him credit for this, a bipartisan group of congressmen pushing for expanded benefits and increased compensation for victims of nuclear testing. He was co-sponsor of the House bill that would have expanded the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act to include all of Utah, not just small rural counties, Arizona, Nevada, New Mexico, Colorado, Idaho, and Montana. He was critical in getting Congress to declare January 27th, the day of the first test at the Nevada test site, as a National Day of Remembrance for Downwinders. Jim, thank you so much for your work. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mary. When I was asked to come and participate in this program, I was very excited to do so, and I readily agreed. I didn't know I had to follow Mary Dickson, though. They didn't tell me that till after. And Mary's always been such a wonderful voice for this issue, and you got to experience some of that again today. And Mary went over some of the history of the number of tests. It's interesting during that testing period that obviously folks, American citizens, were just never warned. They were never warned about the possible dangers. They were never alerted to possible health effects of exposure to radiation. They were told it was safe. And yet we all know that the testing protocol, as Mary mentioned, was to only conduct the testing when the wind blew the fallout in what was the less populated area, which was eastward towards southern Utah. Turns out that the public health researchers and the military had studied the implications of radioactive fallout and weapons testing in 1961 and discovered a number of serious negative health effects, but these findings were suppressed until 1979. My history on this issue starts, I remember it was when my dad was governor, and I remember coming home one night and he was sitting at a desk, and he had a yellow legal pad, and it had all this handwriting on it. It was a list, and he was going through the names, and he was saying, well, that's a cousin, that's an uncle, and it was a yellow pad that folks down in Iron County had just put together, writing down everyone they knew who died of cancer. And of course, my dad's roots are in Iron County as well. And that was the first time I'd heard about this issue. And it was pretty remarkable to see that list. And of course, that got his attention, as you might have imagined. And Dad was part of the effort as governor of Utah to help get a number of the documents that had been classified for so long to become declassified. And of course, in getting those documents released, you know, it validated just what Mary had indicated, that in fact the government did lie. They lied to people, they said it was safe when they knew it wasn't. There's no doubt about that. I remember my dad talking about his stories and the stories to tell of others who would wake up and get outside and watch the skylight up in the morning from the open air tests. People in St. George and Cedar City and throughout southern Utah really, they were patriotic. They believed they were supporting their country and their government. They were trusting. Those stories are pretty powerful, and that's, as Mary said, why these stories are so important for us to remember. We should also remember the way the government viewed folks living there. You know, one of the quotes in the Atomic Energy Commission notes that came out later referred to the people living in southern Utah as a low-use segment of our population. Of course, that work to get all of this information in the public domain and to get the history of what really happened during the nuke testing and what it meant for people living downwind. One of the results of that effort was the legislation called the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act. That was passed in 1990. And the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act offered compensation to victims of the nuclear testing, also for uranium miners as well. And it was defined by certain types of cancers or certain geographic areas. And what was most important from my perspective about that was not the money per se. It was really that the government, in an overt way through an act of Congress, acknowledged that they'd done something wrong. That was the real important aspect of RECA from my perspective. I mentioned that the bill was passed in 1990. Coincidentally, that's the year my dad died of multiple myeloma as a downwinder. I was elected to Congress in 2000, and when people ask me, why are you running for office and what motivates you and what's your view of governance, the experience of my family and so many others with the downwinder issue informed that answer. I would tell people that what I've learned is that it's important to hold the government accountable, that we believe in this system, but this system, to work well, has to have the public always hold the government accountable and encourage a transparent approach to public policy. It's sort of a lesson I learned from my dad, you know, even though he died of multiple myeloma and obviously was outraged by the government's deceit and the way it treated folks in the downwind community. He never shook his faith in the system of government we have in this country. He always was an optimist about that this is the right way to do things. If you follow the process and do it right, this is a great system we have in this country. But it certainly informed me in my time in Congress as well about one of my key roles was to make sure that you hold everyone accountable, get everything out in the open, be as transparent as possible. During my time in Congress, I think there were a couple of issues that really came into play that were interesting relative to the downwinder issue. The first was the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act. I said it happened long before I got to Congress, but at the time it was rather arbitrary in terms of how it defined who was eligible and who wasn't. It was based on a few county boundaries on a map. It was a set of county boundaries that didn't really reflect a large geographic area by any means. And as Mary mentioned in her comments, we ultimately were pursuing legislation to greatly expand the geographic area that would be covered by the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, and also expand the list of cancers that would allow people to qualify for that. Because we just knew more. We knew more by then than perhaps was known back when the original Radiation Exposure Compensation Act was being covered. One of the key pieces of information, and I was talking with Preston right before the program started about this, the National Cancer Institute published its study of looking at exposure to one particular isotope iodine-131. And this is a study that had been completed but was kept under wraps for a long time. Ultimately, unfortunately, it was leaked by someone, and the map came out, and it showed where this particular isotope had traveled far and wide. I remember on the map, in fact, there were certain counties in upstate Vermont that had significant exposure to this particular isotope. And it really validates the issue that Mary mentioned in her remarks about this is a national issue. And so when we pursued the expansion of the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, quite candidly, we didn't pursue it for the whole country. We tried to pick something we thought was achievable, and we included the various states surrounding Utah and expanded the list in an effort to try to make sure that the Radiation Exposure Act better articulated the damage that took place from nuclear weapons testing. And another part of when I was in Congress where Radiation Exposure Compensation Act came into play that was kind of upsetting was Congress wouldn't fund it. They wouldn't fund the pool of money that was supposed to be paid out to people. So we had a situation where I would have people from Utah or downwinders come up to me and say, you know, I qualified for the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, and I've got this piece of paper saying someday if Congress appropriates money, I get paid. It's like we gave them an IOU. You know, people dying of cancer have an IOU. Unbelievable. And fortunately, there was an effort to make sure that that fund was better funded. I tried to make it a mandatory fund where it wouldn't require annual congressional action to fund it. We weren't successful making it mandatory, but we were able to address that IOU situation because that was just unconscionable. The second issue that really dominated my time in Congress and got a lot of my attention was the issue of if we're ever going to return to additional nuclear weapons testing. You know, it's hard to imagine with all you've just heard today and the legacy of the nuclear testing experience in this country that we'd think about starting it up again. But you know, when I was in Congress, I remember I first learned that the Bush administration at the time, President Bush through the National Nuclear Security Administration, had been requesting funding from Congress for new nuclear weapons research. Congress had lifted a decades-old research ban and had funded something called enhanced test site readiness and research on 2 new nuclear weapons programs. This is in the early part of the 2000s. The 2 weapon systems, one was called the Robust Nuclear Earth Penetrator, and the other was called the Advanced Concepts Initiative. This was driven by all kinds of reasons. People in the weapons labs were looking for work to do. We'd just gone through 9/11 and we're talking about the deeply embedded bunkers where people were hiding in Iraq or in Iran. A lot of factors probably were leading to this desire to move ahead. And supporters of those folks who wanted to create new nuclear weapons said, well, don't worry, because we won't have to test them. Don't worry about it. At the time, the National Academy of Sciences had already said nuclear weapons testing, and I'll quote this, would be essential to certifying the performance of new designs at the level of confidence associated with currently stockpiled weapons. At the time, Dr. Robert Nelson, who was a physicist and research staff member at Princeton University, agreed with that assessment, and he wrote that, quote, if Congress were to authorize the nuclear weapons laboratories at Los Alamos and Lawrence Livermore to pursue a completely new design, an implosion device using a boosted primary, inherent uncertainties in warhead performance would almost certainly require that the weapon be fully tested. Now, as Mary mentioned in her comments, you know, these tests went from above ground to underground, and that might have, for some people, created an impression that, okay, that's okay. But the data shows that the underground tests emitted all kinds of fallout. And so the underground tests should not give us any cause to think, okay, things are going to be okay. Now, when this was going on, this notion about developing these 2 new weapon systems, the National Nuclear Security Administration publicly denied that there were any plans for resuming testing. However, a leaked Nuclear Weapons Council memo that was written in October 2002 stated, quote, it would also be desirable to assess the potential benefits that could be obtained from a return to nuclear testing. In 2004, the U.S. House of Representatives Appropriations Subcommittee that oversees the National Nuclear Security Administration finally became suspicious of superficial assurances that the robust nuclear Earth penetrator activity was only a study and refused to provide any additional funding. The subcommittee's bipartisan report further added that the objective of the Nuclear Security Agency, quote, was to advance the most extreme new nuclear weapon goals irrespective of any reservations expressed by Congress. So in this environment, that led me to an idea. While I wanted to stop that from happening, I encouraged the reduction of funding, I decided that I wanted to put another roadblock in place. And I drafted legislation called the Safety for Americans from Nuclear Testing Act. I thought it was kind of an interesting idea that if we are ever going to go down the path, which I never thought we should do, maybe we ought to make sure it's safe before we do it. And so I drafted legislation that said, okay, before you can do testing, you've got to go through a traditional National Environmental Policy Act review process, where all the public gets to be involved and all the data gets put out there, and we're going to have a conversation about the safety of this potential activity. It also required that Congress had to vote and provide an authorization before there's any resumption of testing at the Nevada test site. Can you imagine right now that's not the case? I mean, granted, Congress holds the purse strings. It seems to me that if something of that extreme nature is going to happen, it ought to require a vote of Congress before we went down that path. And the legislation required at least 1 week's notice, which I was wondering what that would mean if everyone would flurry to the other side of the globe before the test. And it also required an extensive monitoring system by government and private entities to see what happens if we were to go down that path, which of course I decided this legislation, if it ever passed, would prevent it from ever happening, because I did not see how a nuclear testing protocol could ever survive the environmental impact statement process. And then after I introduced that bill, there was another effort to try to look at how we could maybe move ahead with nuclear weapons testing. It was this interesting test that had, you've seen up here on the map all the names of these tests. There's one that's called Divine Strike. I don't even know what Divine Strike means, but we found this, it was a test they wanted to do at the test site. It was with conventional weapons, mind you, but it was 700 tons of conventional explosive. And I'm no aircraft engineer, but I don't think, or missile engineer, but I don't know how you can deliver a 700-ton conventional weapon. So we figured out, wait a minute, what's going on with this? They're trying to replicate that large an explosion. And they said, no, we're just doing it to test, certain, I mean, the military kind of gave a very vague answer. But my staff was able to dig back a couple of years and find documentation that said, yes, in fact, this is a precursor for developing a new nuclear weapon. And it was a really interesting reaction when this came out, because folks in Utah and around the West and the Downwinder community were so violently opposed to this and said, we're not going down that path again. And we got Congress asking lots of questions about it as well. And fortunately, in this case, the Divine Strike test was canceled. That was one of the nice victories that happened during my time in Congress. So those are really the two big issues that I was involved in during my time in public office: the Exposure Compensation Act issues and the ever ongoing effort to look at what's the next generation of weapons and how do we make it happen. At least some people want to make it happen. I was trying to figure out how to make it not happen. So what does that mean in terms of going forward? It reminds me of the often paraphrased quote from George Santayana: those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. As time progresses, we're going to lose more and more of our vocal advocates on this issue. It really validates the importance of this project and why we're here today in this archive at the University of Utah. It's so important this information is accessible for people and future generations. We need to talk about being vigilant in terms of keeping an eye on the situation, and we need to always be calling for accountability. And this treasure trove of information that's here in this archive is going to be the basis for how we can remind people the future of what this really means. Because when we talk about the future, we all know the future is very uncertain. But there's one thing of which I am certain about the future, and that is folks within the national security community and the national labs are going to periodically advocate for creating a new generation of nuclear weapons. And if they're going to do that, they're also going to advocate for wanting to resume testing of nuclear weapons. That I can say with certainty. And that's why it's so important that we never forget the legacy of what happened in the past, and that we maintain that vigilance and ask for accountability in the future. So I want to commend the Marriott Library for coming up with this and making this program happen today, but more importantly, creating this extensive archive of information, which I think is going to protect future generations, and we'll all benefit from that. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that. You can see why he was our most passionate advocate in Congress, and thank you, thank you. It's my pleasure now to introduce Justin Sorensen. He's the GIS specialist for the J. Willard Marriott Library's Creativity and Innovation Services Department, where he works to create, manage, and develop geospatial mapping and data visualization projects for use by students, researchers, and the public. Justin works closely with students, staff, and faculty at the University of Utah to help them achieve project goals and visualize their information in a geospatial context. In 2015, Justin and his GIS services unit began creating and developing the Downwinders of Utah Archive, which is a unique resource that brings together the history of nuclear testing at the Nevada test site and the impacts these tests have had for downwinders throughout Utah. Justin, you've done an incredible job. I thank you. Come tell us about it.
Well, thank you, Mary, Jim. It's wonderful information you've shared with us. I hope I don't take too much from you, a little bit over. So anyway, it's my pleasure today to introduce you to a creative and innovative archive designed to bring together and present information on Utah's nuclear history in a way that educates others of the impacts nuclear testing has had throughout Utah. Beginning in 1951, the era of nuclear weapons testing was a time of tremendous change at both national and local levels. In the name of national security, a variety of nuclear weapons were tested in a remote area of the Nevada desert, known as the Nevada test site. Fallout and radiation from these tests have affected communities across the nation, in many cases resulting in the loss of property, health, and life. The Downwinders of Utah Archive presents an in-depth study of the nuclear detonations, radioactive fallout, and events which have led to devastating results for Utah's downwinder population. Through the presentation of an interactive timeline, detailed information on each atmospheric nuclear test conducted at the Nevada test site found to produce off-site radioactivity is presented, as well as fallout statistics for all Utah counties, geospatially visualized and presented based on raw data through cartographic maps, animated reconstruction models, interactive motion charts, and a variety of graphics related to testing methods, cloud heights, and dispersal patterns. The archive also presents historical photographs and videos of nuclear detonation tests being conducted, archived newspaper articles, and documentation depicting impacts and deception imparted to residents, as well as oral history interviews from Utah downwinders. All these components will be touched on during this presentation. Through the Downwinders of Utah Archive, viewers are able to examine the contained information and utilize it within educational and research endeavors. The searchable timeline allows for easy access to time-specific data, visualizations, and information on demand. Each component presents detailed information regarding each event, as demonstrated in this example, presenting information on the test name, date, time, device type, yield, atmospheric release of iodine-131, a nuclear byproduct focused on throughout the Downwinders of Utah Archive, and much more. Historical photographs and videos captured for each event have been included to provide viewers with a real-world depiction of each event, while simultaneously incorporating satellite imagery and three-dimensional visual models of individual test sites as a frame of reference and a representation of how these locations appear today. In this video example of a nuclear detonation test being conducted, we're viewing the first and only test of the atomic cannon, conducted in an operation later known as Upshot Knothole Test Grable. This was held on May 25th, 1953. You'll notice that following the devastating blast, the deadly mushroom cloud quickly rises high into the atmosphere. One of the primary features of the Downwinders of Utah Archive is the geospatial visualization of nuclear fallout events. In particular, the examination of iodine-131 ground deposits for all counties throughout Utah. Iodine-131 being one of the many nuclear byproducts produced during a nuclear detonation and found to be associated with thyroid cancer. Scientists have found that following a nuclear detonation, nuclear sediment is lifted high into the atmosphere and carried away from the test site by wind currents. These nuclear sediment then return to the Earth's surface, generally over pastures and populated areas. In addition to general fallout exposure, scientists have found that the sediment attached itself to the grazing material of sheep, goats, and cows, whose milk was highly consumed and utilized by local farmers and populations of the day. To examine the extent of this fallout among Utah downwinders, cartographic maps and geospatial visualizations have been created to examine and interpret the raw data statistics in ways previously unavailable. Geospatial visualizations such as these are available for all individual test detonations, test series summaries, and in this example, a complete overview of all iodine-131 recorded for Utah. You'll notice that for Utah, some of the highest levels occurred around St. George and the surrounding area, which at the time consisted of farmers and Mormon settlers, a segment of the population which at the time the government considered to be low use. Detonation reconstruction animations have been created to portray the setup, detonation, and aftermath of each type of nuclear test conducted at the Nevada test site. Each testing method was extensively researched and subsequently reconstructed using data from the United States Department of Energy, as well as aircraft and device specifications from Boeing and Wikipedia. These detonation reconstruction animations are available in both 2- and 3-dimensional formats. Historical photographs of aircrafts, atomic guns, and devices were used as a reference when modeling each animation to ensure the maximum possible resemblance and realism. All animations include annotations throughout the course of the detonation to describe and break down each stage of the explosion to the viewer. The diagrams and charts included within the Downwinders of Utah Archive depict a wide array of information related to detonations, radiation exposure, and fallout in general. Motion charts now allow us a new perspective on thyroid dosage and iodine-131 concentrations by allowing viewers the opportunity to interactively compare one set of raw data to another in a visual and dynamic way. The resulting comparisons can be depicted across all counties in Utah, or a few can be highlighted for a more specified study, with each test shot, summary, and overview having their own corresponding motion chart. Cloud height diagrams have been created to show the scale of mushroom clouds resulting from each nuclear test blast. One graphic has been created for each test shot conducted at the Nevada test site in which off-site radioactivity was found. To further demonstrate the sheer size of these mushroom clouds, a scaled group of buildings have been included along the bottom, each of which being at one point in time the tallest building in the world. These range from the Empire State Building in New York City to Burj Khalifa in Dubai. And in addition to this, as you came in, you may have seen our 3D model sitting there. That's actually to scale of one of the more deadly blasts that took place at the Nevada test site. Was known as Operation Upshot Knothole Harry, later became known as Dirty Harry. Diagrams depicting the methods by which humans are exposed to iodine-131 and the resulting health effects fallout has on the human body have also been included. These are especially significant as they show how many downwinders became exposed and the path by which fallout was absorbed into their system. Historical events and publications comprise a considerable portion of the Downwinders of Utah Archive, chronologically relaying information and events as they progress. Major events detailed include court cases with sheep ranchers and victims, with external links to official transcripts for review. Testing ban treaties, such as the limited test ban, which later changed how nuclear testing was conducted by prohibiting all test detonations in the atmosphere, in space, or underwater, as well as important government programs such as the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, designed to compensate victims of nuclear exposure, with official links, detailed on qualified applicants, and geospatial visualizations breaking down Utah counties eligible for compensation. Historical newspaper articles and additional documentation have been included to relay information and statements provided to the public while documenting how government positions changed over time with respect to nuclear testing. These positions depict the initial government standing that there were no impacts related to nuclear testing, up to the late 1970s, early 1980s, when victims with fallout ailments were officially recognized. Utah Governor Scott Matheson addressed this in a 1985 KUED documentary where he describes how the government's deception behind nuclear testing was uncovered.
That's when we started to find out for the very first time that our federal public officials, mostly in the old Atomic Energy Commission days, were simply not telling the truth. That's when we found that there was a major effort on the part of the federal government to do two things: to hide relevant information which showed wrongdoing on the one hand, and intimidation of those who were associated with the program to continue funding of that program on the other.
Each related article has been collected and chronologically presented, with a brief synopsis of the main points, a preview of the original article, and a link for viewing the full article via the J. Willard Marriott Library's ProQuest account. And these are just a few of the article headings that you'll find contained within the Downwinders of Utah Archive. Through the Downwinders of Utah Archive, you will find that the Atomic Energy Commission, or the AEC, put extensive amounts of time and energy into presenting a positive image of nuclear testing to the surrounding public. Brochures and public announcements were made describing the importance of American nuclear superiority and the safety measurements taken by the AEC during atomic testing. Residents of St. George and the surrounding areas were told they were a very real part of national defense through nuclear testing, a statement designed to spark their patriotism. While assuring civilians testing posed no danger, the AEC simultaneously admitted that individuals had been exposed to potential risk from flash, blast, or fallout. During emergencies, when the AEC determined it was unsafe for civilians to be outside, radio announcements were made telling everyone to stay indoors. Unfortunately, people were often away from their radio sets and regularly missed such rare warnings.
Ladies and gentlemen, we interrupt this program to bring you important news. Due to a change in wind direction, the residue from this morning's atomic detonation is drifting in the direction of St. George. To prevent unnecessary exposure to radiation, it is better to take cover during this period. Parents need not be alarmed about children at school. No recesses outdoors will be permitted. There is no danger. This is simply routine safety procedure.
In contrast to the AEC's reassuring radio broadcasts, Frank Patrico, a serviceman responsible for monitoring levels of radioactivity, recounts the AEC's hesitance and reluctance to disclose the looming danger facing St. George following the Dirty Harry shot.
I happened to look at my instrument and noticed that in the center of St. George, Utah, where I was located, the instrument was reading well over 300 to 350 milliroentgens per hour, which was just about the range of the instrument. Obviously, these were higher readings than the maximum permissible levels established by AEC on a national basis.
Butrico notified the test site, but his records show almost an hour passed before he was told to issue a warning that the residents of St. George should take cover.
It wasn't too much of a surprise that not everybody had the word. Cars were still on the road within St. George. People were still walking on the streets. And most distressing, when we passed a grade school, we noticed that the children were still on their morning recess, the teacher having not received the information about taking cover. I received instructions to be sure and discard my clothing and to be sure and keep showering until I reduced the amount of radiation that was on my body. I should point out that I did ask whether we should be doing the same thing in an announcement to people in the community. And of course the answer was a resounding no, because this would create a a panic situation.
In addition to public announcements, a number of organizations created propaganda films centered on nuclear warfare and tailored to specific groups on what to do during a potential strike from the Soviet Union. No mention is made in any of these films regarding the looming danger posed by the Nevada test site, only 140 miles from St. George. As part of the Downwinders of Utah Archive, a number of interviews are presented with information on downwinders, nuclear testing, and how the government is making restitution to victims. Jim mentioned some information about RICA, and I just want to retouch on this one more time with an interview that we had with him. In this interview, Jim talks about the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act and breaks down the efforts to bring justice and compensation to downwinder victims.
Ultimately, the tangible admission of the government that it lied and that it was at fault was when Congress passed the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, which is known as RICA. That happened before I got in Congress, but that was a very significant step in my opinion. And to me, it wasn't really about the monetary compensation, it was more about the admission that the government did something wrong. On the other hand, I think it's important for the victims to have access to that compensation. When I first got in office, the challenge was that the fund was underfunded, if you will. So people who were dying of cancer would make their application for compensation under RICA, and the government, in effect, gave them an IOU and said, well, we'll get back to you later, which was unconscionable, in my opinion. And so when I first got in Congress, the effort to make sure compensation victims, victims of the testing receive their compensation, that's the first thing I worked on in this issue. And fortunately, the issue was so compelling. I mean, people in Congress said, wait a minute, we can't do this. We told these people we compensate them, you can't give them an IOU. And so that issue did get resolved, but that was during my first term in Congress. That's what I was really active on.
In addition to interviews such as these, a number of oral history interviews with downwinder victims, families, and advocates are presented, which play an important role within the Downwinders of Utah Archive, as is through stories and experiences that a deeper understanding and connection to history and events are made. As an example of how interviews are presented through this archive, the following excerpt from an interview conducted as part of the KUED documentary 30 Years to Justice demonstrates how stories and experiences bring light to history and events while developing a deeper understanding of topics and the impacts they have within our communities.
And I was sitting on my horse and I just had my leg cocked over the saddle just watching it feed back. And I turned and looked this way and there were some airplanes. I just followed them right along and went right over in here and I was looking right straight into them, and all at once there was a great big flash and a big mushroom cloud come up, and then a second or two later a big boom. And I just went like that. It was just a big flash right over in there. I'd mushroomed up and then it was spreading out. You know, it was spreading out. It was quite a big cloud and it came right over us. And some Army personnel, and they pulled right up to camp beside of us. Of course, we come outside the wagon and they said, my golly, you guys are in a hot spot here. You got to get out of here. Get out of here. There was no way. We had that herd of sheep. We were on our way in. We were going this way toward Cedar to Lamb. We had a little tin roof wagon. And he says, get in that wagon and get under what cover you can. He said, well, get inside your wagon.
Something obviously went wrong with that test shot. Nearby, 200 miners were rushed underground to avoid exposure to radioactive fallout, while Bullock and his herd of sheep were left exposed in the open valley, far closer to ground zero than the miners.
Through the Downwinders of Utah Archive, viewers are able to access currently submitted interviews by selecting an individual's name with a brief synopsis of the main points, a transcribed video of the interview conducted, and a complete PDF transcript for review. Viewers also have the opportunity to record and share their stories and become part of the Downwinders of Utah Archive and its growing number of interviews and personal accounts. The Downwinders of Utah Archive has been created and designed to bring together information on Utah's nuclear history in a way that educates students, researchers, and the public of the devastation produced and impacts to Utah. Newer generations may be unaware of the devastation produced during this era, leading to the creation of a creative and educational tool for understanding the topic in greater depth. The archives focus on individuals, families, and areas that were impacted as a result of nuclear testing, aids in understanding events in greater detail, while educating future generations in hopes that the mistakes of the past will never occur again. It's easy to say that the nuclear testing was performed in the name of national security, but to overlook the impacts those actions have had within our communities could easily result in the same mistakes being made again, a goal which the Downwinders of Utah Archive hopes to prevent. In a final excerpt from our interview with Jim Matheson, these points are emphasized through his statement about the future of downwinders and nuclear testing in our country.
Well, first of all, I think that what folks need to know is that there's not a test that's imminent, but you've got to remain vigilant. During my time in Congress, there have been various efforts to develop new nuclear weapons. The Bush administration had 2 particular nuclear weapons it was trying to develop. Then there was an effort to do a different type of test. It was known as Divine Strike was the name of the specific test. It was not with a nuclear weapon, it was with conventional explosives, but the tonnage was so large it could never replicate a conventional bomb. It was clearly a precursor for nuclear weapons testing, and my office actually uncovered the documents that showed that that's exactly what that test was intended to be. So at various times during my time in Congress, there have been efforts to move ahead with more nuclear weapons testing. And what I would tell anyone who lives downwind is that you can never take it for granted. I mean, I'm not saying we should panic, because there isn't a test that's going to happen right away. But there will always, over the years, be entities that want to move ahead with the new round of testing, and that's why we need to keep an eye on this issue.
Yeah.
The Downwinders of Utah Archive is available for viewing at downwindersofutah.org. We invite everyone to visit the website to view the archive in its entirety while learning how you can contribute to and be part of the growing Downwinders of Utah Archive. And before I turn it back over to Mary, I just want to let you know that following our Q&A, we have computers set up. If you'd like to interact with the archive, we'll be available to answer questions. And also, our audio and video studios will be available if you'd like to share your story, being a downwinder, or if you have a family member that was impacted, that you'd like to share their story. Our audio studios are just across the hall in the Faculty Center, and you can meet with Tony Sams and Robert Nelson, and they'll be able to help you with that. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Justin. You have done a great, great service with this, as has the Marriott Library for putting together this archive. I cannot stress how important this archive is. It is a resource that is so rich, so deep, and so vast. It will make a huge difference, so I do encourage you to check it all out and to tell your story. We're going to move on to our Q&A now, so I will have Jim and Justin join us, and a special guest, J. Preston Truman, who is a downwinder himself. He drove from Malad at 5 this morning. He has spent his life as an ardent activist and advocate for downwinders. He was born in Enterprise, Utah, but he began writing letters and getting involved in this issue when he was only 13 years old. I think that's when you wrote your first letter to Linus Pauling. I call him a one-man movement because he probably knows more about downwinders than anyone, and he's collected extensive documentation. A lot of it he will be donating to the archive. He's been especially active in working with elected officials to secure compensation for downwinders, and he has been probably, I would say, at the center of the movement to expand compensation beyond the current narrowly defined geographic areas. So can we have you all come up? And I hope you all have a lot of questions. I hope you'll ask them. So let's have everyone come up.
I have a quick question for Justin. And it's amazing the amount of information that you have. So can you just describe, could you just describe what you were not able to see? Is there still classified information that you didn't have access to? And what's your sense of the completeness, as vast as it is, but what is your sense of the completeness of the exposure data?
Well, an archive like this, I believe, is going to be continuing to grow. It's pretty much a living project. There's so much information out there, and I believe a lot of information that Preston has, and we're actually working with an author, her name's Sarah Fox. She's going to be donating interviews as well. So I believe there's a lot of information there that still could be put into this archive. So I see that being very beneficial as well. In terms of what I would like to see in it still, Mary had mentioned that there's still a generational impact of this as well, that it wasn't just Downwinders alone, but they're seeing it progress beyond that. I would definitely like to see that research as well, how it's affected different generations beyond that.
I was really, thank you, but I was also asking about if there's information that maybe at the federal level, Atomic Energy Commission data that is behind, is being protected or remains classified, that kind of information?
Absolutely. There are a lot of documents that are not available, and unless someone discovers that they're there, they're not going to tell us either. I think the iodine 131 report and study says it all. They were forced to start that report because of anger by people in rural Utah, in St. George area, and clear up into the Uinta Basin. And one of the politicians, Senator Hatch, finally decided that something had to be done, especially to shut up the people complaining about it. So he pushed for a full-blown hearing, a study on iodine 131 exposure nationwide. After it was done, it had been done, and then it took 7 years to get it done. And then for another 7 years, it sat there unreleased. And the only way it got released is someone in one of the oversight committees or something that was concerned about it and had access to the executive summary of that report. The executive summary was about like this, leaked it to two female reporters, one at the Nevada paper, Mary Manning, and one to Karen Dorn Steele in Tri-City in Washington. As soon as that was done, USA Today decided, oh, hey, this should be our article. And that was the end of secrecy on keeping the iodine 131 report released. But the thing that was most interesting about that is when it was released, we found out where the iodine 131 had went. The hottest county was not Washington County, Utah. It was a county in central Montana, followed by 5 counties in Idaho, starting with Gem County, south of Boise, across the state, and then back to Washington County, my hometown county in southern Utah. And that has been the way it is with all the major studies. And there's now one study today that is the biggest taboo of them all. The Japanese say it, the Cossacks say it, the Russians say it, the Aborigines say it, the people in Tahiti say it, the Arabs in Libya where the French tests say it, but it's taboo to say it here. It didn't stop with us. It didn't stop with our generation. And we cannot find out and cannot get studies going to say what's being passed on to our children, our grandchildren, and our great-grandchildren. I remember one of the most frightening things from my whole thing was when I was second or third letter to Linus Pauling, and I asked him, how long is this going to go on? And he said, the testing we've conducted to date is going to lower the viability of the human species for 100,000 years to begin with. But we can't get that studied.
Yeah. I think one really interesting thing, too, is that the U.S. government funds a study in Chernobyl of what happened to the people downwind of Chernobyl to the tune of like $1 million
Yes.
a year, but they will not do any studies here.
They also provide funding for joint studies with the Cossacks, joint studies with the Russians, and the Marshallese and everybody else, but not about us.
Yeah, one thing I just want to say too about that National Cancer Institute study is it only looked at one isotope from fallout, one of 150. The consequences of a lot of those other isotopes are far worse than thyroid cancer. But that's all it looked at. And that study said that 212,000 lifetime cases of thyroid cancer would be caused by testing.
Yeah, I remember that those of us that were that are 50 or older, back in the 60s, we were all, they were telling us all to build these fallout shelters, and we would have the schools, and we would have the signs, and we can still go around and actually see a few of them once in a while. In fact, the churches were telling us to make them as part of our auxiliaries to our homes and everything else. We were kind of telling us to go into seclusion for months or something until, have water, that kind of thing. And I was wondering if that would be feasible today, and why it's, why that wasn't being deployed at that time or used at that time because we would go through actually drills and things like that to be prepared. And I'm just wondering, during this time of nuclear testing, and we were always going through these episodes of getting ready, why we didn't utilize them as we should have.
The fallout shelters? How many of you remember duck and cover exercises when you were kids?
You tell me to go under a desk.
Yeah, to go under a desk, that's going to protect you from fallout. How many of you remember the Bert the Turtle? There was a turtle by the name of Bert, and Bert the Turtle was there. It told us that we should duck and cover and put newspaper over our heads, and it would be okay. And the fallout shelters, how many of you remember having to go into fallout shelters as a drill at your elementary school? And they'd give you those Clorox jugs you filled with water. I just remember as a little kid thinking, well, what are we going to eat and where are we going to pee? That's what I remember. Anyway.
Mary, I had an opportunity to hear you speak the other day, and you were talking about the half-life, and I don't remember any of the statistics, but how long can you duck and cover in order to remain safe?
Well, okay, it was interesting that in the film that we saw from the archive, they told people to just shower and wash their clothes or to stay in for recess because, okay, iodine-131 has a half-life of 8 days. But there are other cesium and strontium that your bones absorb that can radiate you a lifetime. That's a half-life of what, 30, 40 years?
Yes.
Plutonium is 1,000 years.
24,000.
24,000 years. So, yeah, ducking and cover wouldn't do you much good, and washing your body wouldn't do you much good because it's in the food chain already. Here we go, right here.
Hi, Dave Morrison, Government Information Librarian here in the Marriott. First of all, my congratulations and compliments to Justin and the GIS group here in the library. This is one of the promises of using GIS information in libraries to be able to demonstrate in a visual, two-dimensional way things which previously have only been columns of figures and numbers and maybe some text that people may or may not be impressed by after reading. A slight sidestep, though, is that for the 30 almost years that I've been here, those of us who work with U.S. government information have been talking about the decreasing amount of information which has been made available publicly, as well as trying to emphasize the fact that what we've always started out with publicly has been a minute fraction of what is compiled by the federal government. We know that there's a huge amount of information we do not have access to because it is classified in different ways. And one of our long-standing documents that we've created in the American Library Association Government Documents Roundtable is entitled Less and Less Information About Government Information. And it basically lists year by year the publications and the information which are no longer being made available. This can be reversed with considerable pressure being put on our elected officials and then on the government as a whole to make more information available and not less. But it requires pressure from all of us who have a stake in free government information. Thank you.
It's my understanding that President Obama is considering committing as much as $1 trillion to
Up to 3.
of upgrading our weapons system. We have almost 2,000 nuclear weapons still in existence in various delivery systems, and that would include upgrading the infrastructure. And I wonder, in that $1 trillion or $3 trillion, as you say, over the next 30 years, how much of that might be earmarked for a resumption of testing?
Well, if they start trying to modernize the weapons, they're going to come up. They're going to come up very quickly, sooner or later, to what their oldest and most sacred dogma always was: if you can't test it, you can't build it. And if they're going to spend $1 trillion or $3 trillion to make all kinds of new little weapons, smaller weapons that can be fired and blow holes in the ground and all this stuff, they're sure as hell not going to spend the money on it if they can't test it. And there's only one place that it's going to be tested. They're going to try to test it in this country, and that'll be back in NTS. But there's a little problem there, and I don't think the Downwinders will let them. I think it'll get divine straight again.
I think one thing Preston always says that I like, how it says all victories are temporary. It's what Jim was saying. You have to remain vigilant. You have to keep making noise. It's not ever over.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, sure.
I'm from central Montana. Do you know the name of the county that's the worst for fallout?
Oh, it's the one that's the hardest to remember.
I can't.
Mengers, or what is the?
I can't. I'm sorry, I can't remember. There was a series of 5 books called the U.S. What's Richard Miller's book called? The U.S. Atlas of Nuclear Fallout, and he went county by county across the U.S. of what the levels were. You could probably, I could look that up for you probably.
Yeah, it's.
Was it Mark County?
Yes, that's it. Yeah, and it's really funny because it's not funny, but that they had the highest of their laws, and yet they weren't even get any kind of studies with the like they did with us in Washington County. You know, we were number 6, they were number 1. They'd come down to our schools, march us out, and have us drink 3 different liquids, and then the last one they'd, feel our thyroid, with us. They did that for years. They've never even done that up there.
That's our wheat bread basket area.
Is it? Yeah.
We count.
And see, there's efforts, very strong efforts, from led by Senator Udall in New Mexico, Crapo in Idaho, Bennett in Colorado, to try to push to get this compensation expanded and to get some other hearings going. And it's really important that all of us downwinders, especially those that had the thyroid doses, that we get together and put some pressure on our politicians. Because we've got to make sure they can never go down to that damn desert again and start popping off little of their atomic fireworks. We've had enough exposure. And any additional exposure, no matter how small it is not going to be expose a virgin population. We've already been plastered. And that extends not just from next door to the test site, not just in a few counties down in southern Utah, but clear up into Idaho, Montana. It hit up along the New Hampshire, New York boundaries. And, you know, we have to do something. I mean, one of a lot of us' cries is what we need is justice, not just us. Not just a small little group here or a small little group there. I mean, it's over 208,000 people in the United States came down with thyroid cancer, caused not by anything, not by not getting enough iodine in their diet, but getting too much of iodine coming, belching out of that Nevada desert.
Yeah, Owen Hoffman, who's a researcher at Oak Ridge, in Tennessee, said that anybody who developed thyroid problems, not just cancer, and lived in the U.S. during the years of testing, most likely got it from testing. Okay, that's just one cancer. Yeah.
Jay, what's the current status of the REPA expansion legislation?
Well, we've been sitting there for the last year trying to, the 5 Western senators sent a letter to asking for a full investigation by the government health department about expanding it. They wanted a full-scale hearing before the Senate committee. And as yet, silence is golden. Or silence, or that kind of silence reminds one of a bunch of spoiled potatoes outside of a spud cellar, but they have done nothing.
I kind of want to ask Jim too, because I know once when some of us went back to try and talk to Congress and pass out those maps and explain what happened, what we found is that a lot of them knew nothing about this. They knew nothing about the history of testing. And maybe you could, I don't know if that's what you saw, but we pretty much discovered that they also need to be educated.
Yeah, there's no question. I used to take around, I had a little laminated copy of the map that I took around and showed members of Congress. And it's, you know, look, it's no surprise, politics is very parochial. If they don't know something happened in there, you know, folks in the eastern half of the country don't think about the history of their weapons. The map gives them a compelling reason why they ought to care about it, and so you give people attention. But I'd love to tell you there's great momentum for expansion of RECA, but there's not great momentum for it right now. Preston's right, though. You need a group of senators from these western states, and fortunately, just the ones he mentioned, it's a bipartisan group, which is always the way to get something done. It doesn't take many. It takes a handful who want, if they're committed to this issue. And it's important for us to, I think, redouble our efforts to encourage this group of folks from the Mountain West to join those who are already, look, Udall's been on it forever. You don't need to worry about Tom Udall. He's ready to go. But there are a few others we can move along. I think it'd be very helpful in terms of getting some traction on the issue. But I don't see a lot of activity today.
And what you know you're talking about here is something that really, something like what you're doing here with this archive, is it's going to also depend more so than anything else on how many out there from the public put the pressure on the politicians who haven't signed on to going to expand RECA so far.
Yeah. Okay. Well, one thing I want to show about RECA too, it's not a huge amount of money. It's like one claim is $50,000 that doesn't even really cover a chemo treatment.
Yeah.
That's it.
And under the bills, what Udall and the rest of them are trying to do, they would increase that to to 150,000, but then they would include what we need the most: lifetime medical care. And it doesn't matter, you know, $50,000 in compensation won't pay for one round of chemo treatment. And what do you do? Because you're going to have problems. You know, so they get the cancer under some control. You've had your bone marrow damaged. You've had all kinds of other problems. You need to be checked up all the time. and the bills round up.
It's just also interesting to note, since we're talking about someone that maybe you're not familiar with, but Senator Udall is from New Mexico, and of course his father was Stuart Udall, and Stuart was involved in this issue way back when as an attorney, representing uranium miners that were, and folks on the Navajo reservation. So there's a family history there that has affected current Senator Tom Udall on this issue. But I just thought I'd mention that because I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with that family history.
More questions?
Thank you very much for being here. This touches me personally because my father was actually in the Air Force and served in the Nevada test site and died from cancer of the thyroid, lymph nodes, esophagus, and stomach when I was 15. So I really deeply want to say thank you for the work that you guys are doing. And my question is whether or not this website will have resources on what we can do in order to continue to be involved politically in this as just a citizen. Maybe some resources, ways to contact our politicians and just make sure this doesn't happen to other people. Thank you.
Absolutely. Like we've mentioned, this really is a resource we want to see continuing to educate the future generations. So we want it to be as expansive as possible and detailed. So this will definitely something.
I got to say though, I got to assume there are limitations on what a university website can do in terms of making this a political organizing effort. Let's just call it what it is. This is a tremendous resource and it's got all kinds of information, but it's not going to satisfy, I think, what you're looking for.
Along that line, you have people out there in the general public that aren't as well behaved. And we're going to be launching our newest website stuff to push for that compensation within the month.
Yeah.
And you can find it, it's Faces Downwind. And it's not going to be politically correct. And it's not going to shut up very easy. We want that compensation things expanded. We want to get some more studies going on the subject, and we are not going to tolerate ever returning to any more testing at the Nevada test site, no matter what the excuse.
Okay, do we have time for one more? All right. Oh, there's one.
Is there ever going to be a way to correlate the mortality rates with some of these numbers? Because I would think, obviously, that's a huge project, but that would get a lot of attention.
Richard Miller, who did the map you saw where the fallout went, that 5-volume compendium he put together, the U.S. Atlas of Nuclear Fallout, one thing he did, because he loves data, he just loves messing with data, he took that National Cancer Institute study that showed basically every county in the continental U.S. got some level of fallout. And then what he did is he went to the CDC to look at cancer rates, and so he does correlate it. And he says you can't prove, of course you could never definitively prove, but he said you can show a correlation so strong it couldn't have been random. So he has tried to do that, and he can even tell you, like there are counties in Missouri that he said they got the most, is it cobalt? I can't remember what it was that causes colon cancer. And he says that you can pretty much look up and see what cancers are high in what areas. And I know a doctor from Missouri who had very high cancer rates in his county. And he said one thing he wanted to do was to say in those counties we identify for certain cancers, health screening should be done much earlier than is medically recommended. But it's there. I should donate my set to the library. I'll donate it.
There's another point very interesting when you talk about can we get more information. I've done a lot of work not only with the downwinders here. I've worked with, I did a lot of work in Kazakhstan with the Russian downwinders. And it's very fun, it's very strange, the difference in how you look at it. in trying to do studies. Here, you have to prove that the fallout caused that specific cancer. Well, in Kazakhstan, with now coming into multi-millions of dollars being spent by the government, you have to prove that the stuff, that the fallout didn't cause it. And if you can't prove that it absolutely didn't, then it did. Just the opposite of what we do here. And hiding behind these, well, the statistics, you know, all of this, we can't say that. Well, when you go into a town and you've got around a couple of city blocks, you got 5 liver cancers among people who don't drink, who raise their own food and all this other stuff. You got too many brain cancers around corridors where the winds always come through in the spring. You know, it's a little much to say, well, let me see, the statistics just don't show it. Yeah. Well, after all, we bury the dead, they don't.
Okay, thank you all so much for coming. Thank you to Jim, who, thank goodness he was in town and could do this, and for all the work he's done and everything he knows. To Preston, my one-man movement, who will never let this die. I love it. He'll always call me up and say, sharpen your pitchfork. And to Justin, who put all this together. It's absolutely remarkable. To the Marriott Library, thank you, thank you, thank you on behalf of all of us for putting this archive together. And I highly encourage you all to go now, check out, see what's in it. And who are the 2 people you said they should find to tell their stories?
Robert Nelson and Tony Sam.
Okay, can you 2 stand up? Find these people, tell your stories, tell your father's story. The stories, again, are such a powerful tool. That's what gets people. It's not all the numbers. I could give you numbers all day, 1 billion curies still in the atmosphere, and people just glaze over. It's the stories that touch people, and it's the stories that compel people to get involved and make a difference. So please find these 2 gentlemen and tell your story. Also, I want to tell you tonight, there's another event at 6 o'clock in this very auditorium. We will be showing a film. It's probably the best film I've seen on Downwinders. Not many have been done. He is central in this film. It's called Downwinders. Tim Skousen, Tyler Bastian did it. Incredible film. You should see it. And then we will all be on a panel afterwards as well. So please come to that.
That's the Richard Miller stuff?
Oh, you've got it. You have it. Yay. All right. Anyway, thank you. Go to the computers, tell your story, and I don't know if there's still coffee and such, but go have coffee.